Alright, so this is just going to be a quick review of the study guide for Exam 1. This is posted for you guys. I'm just going to hit the highlights here, but if you have specific questions as you're studying, please feel free to let me know. Remember that the exam is going to be released on Monday, February 6th at noon, so 12 p.m., and then it'll close at noon or 12 p.m. on Monday, February 13th. So make sure that you take it at some point during that time. If you are a student that receives accommodations, please contact me to let me know what accommodations that you need for that. So this is your first exam with me this semester. So my exams are multiple choice, true, false, and matching. One thing that you'll notice is that I do include opinion questions. So the last two multiple choice questions are a little bit different from the other questions. They will ask, what do you think about this person's theory? Or how important do you think this factor is? So you'll get points as long as you answer any of the answer choices for those two questions. Now, Canvas makes this difficult. They don't like to do this. So typically what I have to do is after the exam closes, I go back in and say give full credit for these questions to all students. What this means is that it's just a typical multiple choice question, so I have to mark one of the answers as the right answer. If you happen to choose that answer, you'll get the points. If you don't choose that answer, you won't get the points right away, but you'll get those points added back in after the exam closes. So you might see your grade go up 2 or 4 points after the exam closes because of that. So I do like to give you guys credit for your opinions, okay? Let me know if you have any questions about that. So you will have 75 minutes to take the exam. And I have a study guide here, briefly, the definition of personality. Remember, it has to do with that. It's derived from that word meaning mask. It's kind of what we put on, what we show to other people. But we feel like it's more than that. We feel like it has to do with our behavior. We feel like it tells us how we're going to behave and what we're going to be like in different situations. So we feel like it's fairly consistent. And we feel like it gives us some kind of uniqueness there. So we're talking about theories of personality. That's basically what the class is about. We said that a theory is a big picture idea, one that is vast, and we cannot possibly test it all at one time. So what we do is we come up with hypotheses. Now, a hypothesis is a specific testable piece of a theory. It needs to be consistent with your theory, but it needs to be a small piece that you can go out and test at any one time. So then we test hypotheses over and over and over and over again, trying to test all the different aspects of a theory. Right? So the theories of personality that will see these big picture ideas about humanity and about who we are, they are greatly influenced by each individual theorist's personality, by their experiences, their parents, their health, the time period they grew up in. All of these things do influence them. So if you see a question, are theories of personality unbiased? No, they're biased, but they have to be. There's no way that you can have a view of the world that's not impacted by your particular situation. Criteria for evaluating theories, so we look at, is it parsimonious? In other words, is it not made more complicated than it needs to be? Is it as simple as possible? We look at does it generate research, right? Is it internally consistent? Does it make sense when we look at it as a whole? And does each little piece make sense in light of the whole? So look at these, look over those. Dimensions of concepts of humanity. So we talked about how, for example, some people have a view that is based on free choice, the idea that we can choose who we are and who we want to be. Some individuals would have more of a deterministic view that whether it be religious beliefs, a higher power, whether it be are unconscious. Someone who has this determinism believes that we don't have much control over who we are and that there's not much we can do about that. We talked about reliability and validity when we were talking about doing research on personality, that reliability means that a result is consistent. So if maybe I give the test today and I give the test again a month from now and I have similar answers there, that's a fairly reliable measure. Now when we're talking about something like personality, personality is fairly stable, so we would expect our measures of personality to be reliable. But reliability is not enough. We don't want to be reliably wrong. We also need to be accurate, and that's where validity comes in, making sure that we're accurately measuring what we are supposed to be measuring. So take a look at that. Freud's theory, the cornerstones, sex and aggression. that we have these unconscious desires to have sexual pleasure and to hurt other people and or to be hurt, and that a lot of what we do is based on that. Take a look at Freud's life. We know, I did mention that Freud did use drugs. Freud was a big proponent of cocaine, thought that it was a miracle drug. He thought that cocaine was useful for treating a wide variety of things. We do know that cocaine does work fairly well as a local anesthetic, although that's probably not the safest local anesthetic one could choose, but that the other things that Freud suggested it was useful for, not so much. Levels of mental life, we know that Freud would say that we have conscious, that we are aware of, but that's a very small part of who we are. We have a preconscious, things that we could become aware of fairly easily. And then we have an unconscious, which Freud would say is the most important part of who we are. This is the parts of our personality that we can't access, that we can't reach, unless, for example, we do projective testing. So remember that psychoanalysis involves projective testing like Rorschach ink blots, that kind of thing, where we give someone a neutral stimulus and they project their unconscious feelings onto it. So projective testing is going to be used here to try to make the unconscious interpretable, but you're going to need the therapist to interpret that. Id, ego, and superego. This is the order that they develop in. Id is first. Very young children have an id. The id wants what it wants, and it doesn't care how it gets it. It just wants to get it. The superego is the last one to develop, and the superego is all completely focused on morality. We internalize what our parents and what society has taught us about right or wrong, and this can make us feel guilty or feel shame. So the ego is kind of stuck in between these two. It's the executive. It's the one that is trying to balance the two, trying to find a way to meet the id's needs without feeling guilty and feeling shame from the superego. We talked about drives and anxiety. Take a look at that. Remember that the drives, we talked about the cornerstones are sex and aggression. So we have drives towards sex and aggression. And we said that there are some ways to combine sex and aggression, like masochism, sadism, enjoying being hurt or enjoying hurting other people could combine those two. We talked about defense mechanisms, ways that the ego tries to cope. Denial, just flat out refusing that something could possibly be true. Projecting, maybe taking the parts of yourself that you can't stand and not seeing them in yourself, but seeing them in other people. We talked about regression, so individuals kind of going back to an earlier stage of life, kind of regressing when they're in stressful situations, like children wanting to go back to diapers or pacifiers, that kind of thing. So look over those. Psychosexual stages, Freud believed we developed through these stages. We have an oral stage first, where for the first 18-ish months of a child's life, it's all about their mouth. They put things in their mouths, they breastfeed or they bottle feed. This is how they receive pleasure and get their needs met. And then Freud would say someone who has problems during this stage might develop an oral fixation, where they constantly have to have something in their mouths. Then we move into the anal stage here for the next 18-ish months of life, where children start trying to potty train. And so then they receive pleasure over being able to control that. But then once again, if they're shamed or if that doesn't go well, then they could develop an anal fixation, kind of the perfectionist, things have to be a certain way. And then we go into the phallic stage, which is about 3 to 6, somewhere in there, where we have children, or they become aware of their sexual drives, according to Freud. And so then that's when they start to have those complexes we talked about, Oedipus Complex, Electra Complex. The idea that a child starts to feel sexual desire towards their opposite sex parent, and because they know that they're not supposed to feel that way, but at this age they feel like they can't control that. They try to control that. Maybe the child starts to feel angry towards the same-sex parent because that parent does get to be with the opposite-sex parent. And so to try to handle that aggression and that emotion that they feel towards their same-sex parent, they actually try to impersonate that parent, try to be more like them. They try to convince themselves that they actually want to be that person because they can't stand the thought that they might hate that person or want to hurt that person. Right now, Several of you mentioned in your activities that the psychosexual stages and the Oedipus and Electra complexes in particular were something you disliked about Freud's theory. You're not alone in that, but that was Freud's idea. Then after that phallic stage, you would go into a latent stage where those sexual drives kind of are suppressed. They become dormant. They don't go away, but they're less important. And then when you reach puberty, there's a genital stage that pretty much lasts for the rest of your life, where sex is one of the most important things. Although Freud did suggest there might be some individuals who reach a maturity level where sex is less important, right? Free association just had to do with saying whatever you wanted to say, and that if you did that long enough, your unconscious would come out, your defense mechanisms would drop. Dream analysis, Freud said that dreams are important. The manifest content of the dream is just literally the content of what happened. So the client tells the manifest content to the therapist. The therapist then interprets the latent content, which has to do with the secret hidden meaning of the dream, right? Freudian slips. Freud would say that there are no such thing as coincidences. You don't accidentally say something. If you said the wrong name or that kind of thing, you meant it. That there are no such things as accidents. Obviously, we have issues with Freud's theory, pretty much impossible to falsify, worked with a very small population. In other words, he worked with wealthy women during a particular time period, many of which reported having childhood sexual abuse, so that doesn't necessarily mean that his results generalize to everyone. All right? And then Adler, from this week, we were talking about how Adler is different from Freud in that Adler felt like we had some control over our personality, focused more on social influences, less on the unconscious, although he did say the unconscious was there. We know that Adler was a second child, that he had an intense rivalry with his healthy older brother because Adler had health issues. Adler would say that we are always striving towards something because we're born with a sense of inferiority. We're always trying to compensate for that. Now, sometimes we try to do this by looking out only for ourselves and trying to have our own personal success. Sometimes we do this by wanting something that is good for humanity, not just our own personal superiority, but something that improves humanity in general. So our final goal has to do with what we expect will happen in the future, which is important. Remember that Adler would say that your subjective perception of reality is more important. It's not so much what's really going on as much as what you think is going on. Because if you don't realize it's going on, it's not going to impact you as much, right? So that's the idea of fictionalism, that our final goal is actually a fiction because what we believe is going to happen is not necessarily going to happen, but that's okay because it impacts our reality and it impacts our behavior, and so it's still important. Now, remember Adler would say that individuals are all born with an inferiority complex. However, individuals who have health issues are at an increased risk for a higher level of inferiority. Now, that higher level of inferiority is then going to likely make that person work harder to try to overcome that, and sometimes that might have negative consequences. They might strive in a less successful or less healthy way. So, Freud would say that your unconscious is in control, in the driver's seat, and often wants things that are different from your conscious. Adler would say that the conscious and the unconscious work together towards the same goal. You do have unconscious parts of your personality, but they're working together. Social interest being very important. Your feeling of having healthy relationships and being at one with society. Adler would say that your style of life is basically your personality. It is what you think about yourself, your attitude towards life and towards the world. And so your style of life is made up of your genetics, your environment, and your creative power. Creative power being your ability to change your own behavior and your own personality and to control that at least somewhat, right? Now, Adler would say that sometimes abnormal development happens if we've been neglected or pampered, or potentially this could happen if an individual has health issues. Maybe they feel that increased feeling of inferiority here. Adler emphasized birth order, which was also called family constellations, the idea that oldest children are pampered until they are dethroned by the next child, so they have a high sense of inferiority. Middle children are least likely to be pampered, but that also can be a negative thing if they end up feeling like they have to compete with their siblings. On the other hand, youngest children are the ones that are most likely to be pampered, and then therefore perhaps ones that might develop unhealthy relationships with the people who are pampering them at the expense of other relationships. And then, of course, only children are going to have some combinations of those where they will have pampering, likely, but they don't ever have to compete or take into account other siblings' needs. And so then that individual might be used to people taking care of them. Early recollections has to do with a person's earliest memories. Not always accurate, but that's okay. People tend to tell memories that reflect something about who they are now. And so you can learn about who a person is now from their early recollections. Even if they're not accurately telling you about their early life, they're telling you about who they are now. Adler emphasized dreams, and he did believe in dream interpretation, although it was a little less important than Freud's. And we know that Adler's theory did generate a lot of research, but it was kind of low on falsifiability. It's very difficult to test some of the things that Adler talked about, but it is certainly interesting, and it is a different take on personality from Freud. Alright, so that was a very brief overview of the information for Exam 1. Please feel free to come by my office hours or email me if you have any questions. Remember that I will not be having office hours on February 13th because I will be out of town, but let me know if you need anything. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys next week.